Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good evening. My name is Mateusz Fałkowski and I am Deputy Head of the Pilecki-Institut Berlin, and I will lead this panel discussion, The Soviet Union Faces Poland and the West. On this day in 1939, Stalin's Red Army invaded Poland from the east in accordance with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, also called Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. This year marks also the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Warsaw on August 15 in the year 1920, the decisive moment of the Polish-Soviet War when Poland preserved her independence and stopped the Soviet troops from marching west. In this context, we organized this debate titled "The Soviet Union Faces Poland and the West." This topic has not only its history, but it also has its present. It's becoming a subject of manipulation too, such as, for example, today, even in the social media of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Russian government continues to try to distort the history of the Second World War. In this case, the Soviet Union still with Nazi Germany to divide Poland between them in September 1939. Another dimension of this problem is dimension of broader culture of memory. What do we know about it? What do we remember? What do we want to know? And what were Soviet Russia's, for example, perceptions of Poland in the West? What were their plans and strategies? And what place does the Polish-Soviet War or the Second World War occupy in the memory cultures of the West as well as in Russian memory? Are the pact between Hitler and Stalin of August 1939 and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland from September 1939 present in the cultures of remembrance, for example, in the West? For many reasons, it's therefore worth looking for a broader perspective. Not only to list what exactly happened at the day, but also to understand the broader cognitive and cultural foundations of the Soviet view of Poland, of the West, and also of the war as such, to better understand September 17, 1939, and the specificity of Soviet imperialism. And our distinguished guests will help us to do it, to discuss it today. Professor Françoise Thom is historian, professor emerita of Paris Sorbonne. She wrote extensively about Soviet Union, both about Stalin's phase, but also about perestroika period, the end of communism and Gorbachev. She is also author of Beria biography and also author of the wonderful analysis of the wooden newspeak, doublespeak of the Soviet language. Dr. Jan Behrends of Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam is historian of Eastern Europe. He wrote a lot about, among other things, about propaganda, counter public spheres in communism, about violence, about ideologies, about Pan-Slavism, and he teaches East European history at Humboldt University zu Berlin. And finally, our third guest, Dr. Wojciech Kozłowski, is historian. He's got his PhD in medieval history from Central European University, at that time in Budapest, in the meantime, I guess, already in Vienna. He's director of the Pilecki-Institut in Warsaw. Pilecki-Institut is a research institution which facilitates research on 20th century, enables access to archives, and initiates research projects. And I would like to start our conversation. So I can also one remark for our audience. So if you want to ask the question Q&A section, you can write this question in Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I would like to start the question with the question to Professor Thom. Françoise, what was the DNA of Soviet foreign policy? What was the mindset of Soviet political leadership? What were Soviet perceptions which informed the war against the West and Poland? Could you tell us about it?
I think you have to take into account two elements to understand this DNA of Soviet foreign policy. First element, it's a foreign policy which is based on Marxist-Leninist ideology, which it means it has a determinist worldview. History moves toward the victory of socialism, and that has a lot of implications because there is no place for freedom in this worldview, and there is no place for ethics. Everything that fosters the victory of socialism is good, and it is possible to accelerate the victory of socialism on the whole world. That's the Leninist innovation. It is possible to accelerate the process. This is very important because it's the first time we have a diplomacy which is founded on a deterministic ideology where freedom doesn't exist, freedom of action. The second point, which is important to understand in the DNA of foreign policy of the Soviet Union, it's the early experiences of this foreign policy. I would say the first months of the existence of the Leninist regime are very important. What did the Bolshevik learn during those first months? First, the victory of socialism in Russia was possible thanks to the First World War. Lenin is very aware of that, and all the Bolsheviks were aware of that, Stalin also, that the victory, triumph of socialism in Russia was impossible without a war. So war can be useful for the progress of socialism on the world. Second point, the victory of Bolshevism during the Civil War was possible thanks to the antagonism of the bourgeois states, because the bourgeois states were not acting together against the Soviet state. Finally, the Soviet state could remain triumph of them. And third point, experience of those three early years shows that subversion is not enough to destroy a capitalist or non-socialist state, non-communist state. The Bolsheviks tried to act through subversion, for instance, in Georgia, in Armenia, when Georgia and Armenia were independent states, and this failed. Only the use of the Red Army finally made it possible to realize a Bolshevik takeover in those countries. And this is very important for Stalin's worldview, because Stalin was in charge of communizing those countries, South Caucasian countries. And I think this experience was fundamental in his worldview. So subversion is a good thing, but it's not enough. The Bolshevik tried to, for instance, to destroy the Menshevik government in Georgia through subversion, but it was not enough. The Menshevik were able to crush the communist subversion and to survive. So the Red Army was the ultimate answer. What the Bolshevik learned through the first months of the regime is also a number of foreign policy tactics which I will now try to explain. And this is interesting not only for the Bolshevik, early Bolshevik period, but it was those tactics are used even under Putin. It's still very actual today. First, you have to divide what Lenin used to say. You have to divide the imperialists, to split the bourgeois societies, to split the bourgeois states, to split them among themselves, so that no common front against Soviet Russia was possible. And you had to split also the capitalist societies inside. And for this, you had to use the greed of capitalists. You had to seduce some capitalists and to use them to foster the interest of the Soviet state in the capitalist country. I will give you an example, a very early example. In the spring of 1918, the German staff, military staff, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, wanted to get rid of the Bolshevik and to put a government, a white general in their place. The Bolshevik, Lenin was very aware of this. And what did he do? He began trade negotiations with Berlin, proposed to Berlin a lot of very interesting contracts, concessions on oil and everything, and others, and raw material deals. And this led to the Berlin Treaty in August 1918, which was not, of course, it had no time to be implemented because the Germans were defeated shortly afterwards. But it's interesting because the Bolshevik had persuaded the Germans to keep Baku in Bolshevik hands, promising them, for instance, a quarter of the production of the oil of Baku. And the Germans agreed with this. This is an example. Second example, which will interest you very much because it concerns our topic. During the offensive of Bolshevik offensive in 1920 against Poland, in order to neutralize Great Britain and to convince the British not to help the Poles, Lenin proposed the British trade negotiations. He sent Krasin to London, and they managed to convince the British not to support Poland. Finally, it's only France finally supported Poland in this fight against Bolshevik, against the Red Army, because Lloyd George was seduced with this idea of a trade deal with Russia, Bolshevik Russia. So you see, I could give you a lot of examples of this tactic, even now, using the seducing businessmen to serve the interest of the Russian state. But it began under Lenin. The third tactic, which is very important, defined by Lenin in 1921, in his book about, how do you say, the disease, youth disease of, how is it in English? I don't know. Anyhow, Lenin was trying to understand the causes of the fiasco of the German communists in 1920, 1921. There were attempts of communist takeover in Germany, but they didn't work. And Lenin came to the conclusion that German communists were sectarians. It's funny, the word is funny in Lenin's, under Lenin, in Lenin's mouth, but what does it mean, sectarians? it means that the communists, the German communists, were not able to infiltrate what Lenin calls the organized forms of social existence. They were not able to infiltrate the parliaments, the trade unions, and so on. And Lenin says the communists must not stay aloof in their ideological purity. They must go in bourgeois institutions, infiltrate them in order to destroy them from the inside. This is very important also, and I think it's still, in a way, it's still true of Russian foreign policy today, this world, this way of seeing things. So to conclude this introduction, Bolsheviks think themselves at war with the whole non-communist world. Every country which is not communist is an adversary. In ordinary diplomacy, a compromise is a mutually beneficial agreement. Not so for the Bolsheviks. For the Bolsheviks, a compromise is a way to improve the correlation of forces in favor of the socialist camp. You conclude a compromise when you feel in a position of weakness and you want to wait and to get stronger. For instance, Brest-Litovsk was a typical example of such a compromise. The Bolsheviks were in a position of weakness, but they were waiting for the revolution in Germany. So they were convinced that soon they would be in a position of strength, and they signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So for the Bolshevik, a compromise is useful as long as you cannot destroy directly your enemy, your partner. You reach a compromise with him, it weakens him, and if it weakens him, and it strengthens you. So it's we are very far from an ordinary diplomacy. It's the originality of Bolshevik foreign policy. And again, I think all those features that I have defined are still very, very actual now.
So, thank you, Françoise. Jan, Françoise told us about this longue durée of this tactics, semantics, and DNA of Soviet and Russian foreign policy. What is for you so the most important thing? What is the driver, or what is this most important factor which determined the way Soviet Union perceived war, perceived the West, and perceived Poland? What was the role of the war, for example, in Soviet system, and what was the justification? So maybe this Pan-Slavism was kind of justification. What any other kinds of justification you see?
Dobry wieczór, panie, panowie. First of all, thank you for having me, Mateusz, Wojciech. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I think the question about the role of war and violence in the formation of Russian Soviet foreign policy after the revolution is a very valid one, very interesting one, but maybe we have to distinguish between different wars that were fought at the time. There's of course World War I, where the outcome of World War I was in Eastern Europe, a Europe of independent and sovereign nation states, which was something new in Eastern Europe, at least in modern Eastern European times, because Eastern Europe had been an imperial sphere divided between Germany, Russia, the Austrian Empire, and the Turkish Empire. And we have a whole new situation in 1918. And again, like Françoise, I would stress the continuities. Today, we still have the problem that it is not really decided or that it is not agreed upon, let's say, by all states in the region, whether this region of Central and Eastern Europe should be dominated by imperial powers, which is still the Russian position, I guess, or whether it should be a realm of independent nation states. I always tell students, rhetorically, you can ask the question, do you think that Latvia is just as independent as Portugal or Luxembourg? Or why should it not be so? But for a lot of people, still they think that for some reason, Riga should not be as much of a sovereign state as the established states of Western Europe. And I think that goes to the heart of the problem of 1918, that in a way was neither solved by the First World War. Then we have sort of like this imperial backlash of 1939, of course, nor was it solved by the understandings of 1989, 1991, when we thought that we had finally agreed upon sort of like a Wilsonian Europe. But we can see that one of the things that Russia is fighting tooth and nail at this point is exactly that idea of a Wilsonian Europe of sovereign states. Second war, I think that's very important to understand Russia and Russian foreign policy, is the Civil War, of course. And again, Françoise has mentioned this, especially when it comes to foreign relations, but I think it goes even beyond foreign relations. I mean, the whole Bolshevik notion of how to do politics is very much influenced by the struggle for survival that we see during the Civil War, during these 4 long years, where politics, and we have to see this quite literally, I think, for Lenin and his comrades is a struggle for survival. They know if they lose, they're not going to survive this. It's kill or be killed. And that's very much something I think that determines their worldview, and then later Stalin's worldview, that it's always this existential struggle that you're in, actually. And this was confirmed by the Civil War, but it is in a way then confirmed by the ongoing struggle, let's say, for example, against the peasants in Russia, against the church, against everybody who is seen as an enemy. Because the Kremlin does not only see, as Françoise rightly pointed out, all the Western states as enemies, it also has all these enemies at home that they're also at war with. They're at war with 80% of the population, which are the peasants. They're at war with the church, which is still a mighty institution, and so on. So this notion of war and struggle is actually a bigger one. And maybe a third last point, it's also worth thinking about how and when does the Second World War start for Russia, at least in the mindset of the elite. And I think it's often overlooked if we look at the history of the 5-year plans, that the first 5-year plans from 1928, 29 onwards were always about not only rearmament, but actually putting together the biggest army on the planet. That and nothing less is what Stalin is doing from then onwards. Nobody, not even Nazi Germany, has such a gigantic armament program, as the Soviet Union in the 1930s. It becomes a very much militarized state after the end of the new economic policy and with the start of the 5-year plans. And this leads directly into the war that is always there to be expected. I mean, Stalin is expecting this war from the beginning of the 1930s, even before Hitler comes to power in Germany, and independent from that. I mean, he's maybe thinking more about a war with Japan or England, but this war is very much on the Soviet mindset from the beginning. And finally, the ideological perceptions, I think they change. I mean, the Bolsheviks are pretty flexible here. You have, of course, World Revolution, and that's what Komintern is for. You have the Foreign Office, which is a little bit more conventional, and people like Maisky, the ambassador in London, who, for example, wants some sort of deal with the West. You have other people like Molotov and Stalin, who don't have a problem making deals with Hitler. But in the end, you recycle concepts. If you, for example, ask about Pan-Slavism, Lenin hated Pan-Slavism, and he didn't, use it. And he on a couple of occasions states that it's, not something that the Bolsheviks should use because it's not a class concept. But Stalin used it very much in 1939 when he invades Poland. And again in 1944, when he sort of like comes back to these lands to make a case for brotherly Slavic friendship against Germany or against Poland. You know, it's also very flexible. The 1939 Pan-Slavism is inherently anti-Polish. It's about the Ukrainians and the Belarusians standing up against the Poles. The one of 1943, 1944 then becomes anti-German. I think this is also sort of like this playing with concepts, or, you know, just using different patriotisms and concepts from the bourgeois times, from the 19th century, where the Bolsheviks feel that they fit.
Thank you, Jan. Wojtek, from your perspective as a historian who is trying to tell the story about German occupation, but more than German occupation, but also about the whole complexity of Polish experience of 20th century. So is from your point of view, so the story of Soviet imperialism, of Soviet fundamentals of Soviet policy. So how does it look like? So this is the story which is already boring, or already told, already something taken for granted in Poland, or maybe not. So what is the Polish perspective on this issue, which were told by Jan and Françoise?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and for this unique opportunity to sit together with Françoise and Jan. It's a privilege. Thank you for this. Regarding your question, I think every single generation has a story to tell, and of course the amount of historiographical effort to analyze the immediate or recent past is accumulating, and the interpretations sort of evolve around the issues, the contemporary issues that happen around us in the world. And I believe that every single generation has its questions, has its problems to look into the past, to ask about. And regarding this rivalry competition between, or conflict between Poland and Soviet Union in the 20th century, I think on one hand, many issues, many facts have been told and laid out on the table. But on the other hand, it is always a challenge for us to make sure that what the questions we're asking to ourselves are the questions that remain only within the fairly small group of historians who are discussing these topics, or how much all this knowledge and all these interpretations are actually going beyond that to the broader audience. I mean, from the Polish perspective, what you have what you have when we talk about the Soviet presence in the East, starting from the Russian Revolution in 1917, is that nearly at the same time we have the re-emergence of Poland on the European continent as an independent country. So when the Bolsheviks are actually building their own government and their own empire in the East, the Poles are trying to put together a state that has not existed for more than 120 years. And at the same time, this is a very difficult moment for the whole European history, because the First World War is a huge shock and a sort of transformative experience for the entire continent. And as it was already mentioned before, this is actually the moment that the Bolshevism and the communism in itself can rise and can start building its own position on the European stage. So the Poles are building their state, and from the very start they have to defend it. And when we talk about the 1920 Battle of Warsaw, which is a part of the whole campaign from 1919 to 21 in the Polish-Russian or Polish-Soviet War, that from our perspective is the moment of great triumph, the triumph that sort of fends off the threat of expanding revolution and communism from the East throughout the entire continent up to the western shores of Atlantic. I think this is the moment that it's very often forgotten and poorly known for the broader audience in the West, and in Poland itself. It has been reminded many times in the last weeks because of the 100th anniversary, but this is again one of these moments that are becoming, at least in my understanding, more and more difficult to be understood or to be properly comprehended by a current generation. I mean, don't forget that people who are now 18 years old, they were, or less, they were born in the 21st century, 20 years after the collapse of communism. I mean, in this part of the world. So it's like, what are we talking about when we remember the Battle of Warsaw? Shall we remember Battle of Grunwald in the same way from 1410 between Poles or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth against the Teutonic Order and the Knights coming from the West? So it's like either a question about remembering the past as a distant element of our identity, or something that actually has its effect on who we are these days. And the 1920, the year 1920 seems to be a very important moment to the identity of the interwar Poland. And it also built the legend of powerful Polish army that actually managed to defeat the Red Army, which actually happened. So in 1939, there was this hope that the same army it will be powerful enough to fight away the Germans, and will be the one that actually stabilizes the state and the country. And once it failed, the feeling and the meaning of that battle was, I think, diminished. And starting from 1939 and from the Russian invasion, and then after the Second World War and Poland became a communist state, obviously this war within the communist region was not supposed to be remembered. I'm talking about this Polish-Russian War 1919-1921. But at the same time, it was heavily distorted the way the people remembered or were compelled to remember the invasion of 1939. And this invasion was perceived basically as an act of brotherly assistance, of the very true and genuine comradeship with the Soviets and the Poles. And it was that way taught to next generations of students and pupils in school for quite a time. And of course, many people would try to tell a different story within their households, but whenever it came to public considerations, to public discussions, this was always considered as a non-violent act, as opposed or powerfully juxtaposed with the German invasion. So from the Polish perspective, you have more than like 40 years of remembering only one side of the war, which is the German-Polish war, or the Axis against the Allies war, and the Russian part, the Soviet part, is omitted and only brought in as a joint effort to destroy the Nazis. And only after the collapse of the communism, these elements are coming back, meaning the 1920 battle and also the struggles with the communism as an important part of what the contemporary Poland is about, or what is the identity of the Poles these days and of the elites that understand history as the Polish history of the 20th century as a long-lasting experience of conflicting with two totalitarian regimes, the Germans and the Soviets, and in fact with the Soviets much longer than with the Germans.
So thank you. Françoise, so you talked about this tactics and characteristic of Soviet perceptions and Soviet war. Could you give us some examples of how did it function from the point of view, so to say, from the point of view of an insider? So how decisions were taken, how documents were produced or not, what were the decisions and how they were transmitted into the military, or what was the war for Soviet Russia, and from such an so to say organizational point of view?
The answer is very simple about the decisions that were taken by Stalin. They could be taken orally. Sometimes there is no trace in the archives on decisions which were taken. Stalin just could phone or invite a member of the Politburo in the theater, the opera, and give him some instructions. Sometimes it was oral, sometimes there was a decision of the Politburo, but the mechanism is very informal. The mechanism of decision is very informal. Stalin could listen to some of his close companions, for instance, to Molotov. He could listen to objections from Molotov. But usually he was the one who took the decision and imposed them on the others. That's very clear. Concerning his way of seeing the war, I think it's important how Stalin saw the possibility of the Second World War. Already in the middle of the 30s, Stalin was aware that World War was possible. He was, as you remember, Stalin was not. He was more hostile. He was more hostile to German social democracy than to Hitler when Hitler came to power. Hitler was takeover of power by Hitler was facilitated by the attitude of German communists who were ordered by Moscow to destroy the Social Democratic Party. And this has helped, of course, it has weakened the resistance to Hitler, and it has helped Nazi takeover. So this is important. Why did Stalin make this choice? Why did he think that social democracy was worse than Hitler? He was aware that Hitler was a subversive force, would be a subversive force in Europe. And he was aware that he was breaking the front of the capitalist countries, like I just mentioned a little before. And this was the most important fact for him in Stalin's eyes. And the attitude towards war was very ambivalent in Stalin. On one side, he was afraid of the war. The Bolsheviks were afraid of the war. But on the other side, they were convinced that if there was a Second World War, communism would progress in Europe. It would lead to an enlargement of the communist camp, as they used to say. So, and this has led to the German-Soviet Pact in '39, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin chose war. It was a conscious choice of war, with the idea that the war would weaken the Western states. Germany, France, and Britain would destroy each other. And afterwards, the Red Army would come and help the proletarians who would rebel in the belligerent countries. That was Stalin's plan. And of course, the plan was compromised by the quick defeat of France. This is why Stalin was so furious against the French. He was really outraged at the French. He thought the French would fight like during the First World War. And the whole plan of Stalin was destroyed by the French collapse. So, but you have to understand that for Stalin, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was a choice of war. And he chose it because he saw that the Soviet Union would remain aloof, help one or the other, as he said that to Dimitrov when he gave his instruction to Comintern. He said, we will help Germany when it's weaker, and we will help the other when they are weaker. But finally, the Soviet Union had to intervene when the Western power had destroyed each other. That's the logic. And this explains also maybe this worldview explains why the hostility of Stalin toward Poland. Because Poland is a kind of buffer in Europe. It's a kind of bulwark of the West in Europe. And it was very, very important in the Bolsheviks' worldview to destroy this Polish bulwark in Europe. It's very important. Already in the 20s, before the Battle of Warsaw, Stalin wrote to Lenin. We have known their correspondence. Stalin said, we are going to communize Romania, and it's only the first stage. Poland is the first stage. Afterwards, we will communize the rest of Europe. It was conceived as the first step towards the communization of Europe. And the Poles, because of the Poles, it failed. And Stalin was very, very angered by this, and he took revenge on the Poles. I am sure it's the reason why he was so hostile to the Poles and the Katyn massacres.
Jan, do you think that this history of Soviet Union and history of the war was playing the part in building legitimacy of Soviet Union in next decades? And how was it done, and how it developed? So you argued, so to Françoise too, that all these parts of thinking were present probably up to today, but what was the role of this organizational and cultural structures in the Soviet Union in the next decade? So was it important? So this remembrance of the Great Patriotic War and war against the West, against Poland, was it important in building Soviet Union after the war or not?
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. I prefer not to talk about memory, but about the politics of history. And I would say that the politics of history changed quite considerably over the decades after the war. Actually, there's not just one line, and then of course they're very national. I mean, Françoise already talked about it, and Wojciech, you know, the Polish and the French memory. And I think in the Soviet Union or in post-Soviet states today, we see also the disintegration, of course, of the grand Soviet narrative. And now we have Ukrainian narratives and Estonian and Russian and so on. So it's an ongoing process that we can trace from right after the war. And I think right after the war, in the 40s and 50s, Stalin realized that this war needed to be monumentalized. You know, you can see it in Berlin. If you go to the Reichstag, there's the big Russian War Memorial. It was built already in the summer of 1945, which is extraordinary because usually monuments are built, you know, 10, maybe 20 years after the triumph. But in the Soviets, they built these monuments as they win, so to say, as they win the war, as if they are afraid that someone could take it away, right? They built Treptow in 46, 47, which is very interesting because there seems to be this need to show that there's this great victory. But on the other hand, I think Stalin very much realized how great the costs of these of this victory was, and that this is something that could not be talked about. So the numbers of Soviet war dead under Stalin are actually much lower that are given than the reality, because nobody could talk about the reality of 25 million people dead. So they had to talk about 6 or maybe 8 million or something. But they're very reluctant, and Stalin realizes that the actual veterans will have a very not glorified, they will have a view of the war as a terrible event in their lives. So they could not overdo the glorification in the initial phase, you know. And what we see now under Putin resurrected this cult of the Great Fatherland War is actually a Brezhnev invention. We have to realize that under Stalin, 9th of May was not a holiday, it was a working day, right? Only in the 1960s that it becomes a holiday in the Soviet Union, and that these parades and medals and everything is given to the veterans, and that they get this special privileged position. You know, we have social history of the Soviet veterans in the 50s and 60s, and they show that in the initial after-war phase, not very much is done about them. They don't receive apartments, they don't receive medical care. This is only something that happens in the Brezhnev time. So it's very, you know, something that emerges slowly. And under Brezhnev, you get the, of course, interesting impression then that at some point in the 70s or so, the war, the Second World War, becomes more important in legitimization of the regime than the revolution. Under Stalin, who was in the revolution, this was sort of unthinkable, because for Stalin himself, the revolution and Lenin was something that he had, you know, been part of and that he had witnessed. While for Brezhnev, who was too young for that, you know, the war goes center stage, because Brezhnev took some, albeit then later exaggerated, role in that war. And if we want to, you know, of course, this whole narrative then goes into crisis under Gorbachev and is somehow revived a little bit under Yeltsin in 1995, when they have the first military parade again for the Jubilee. And now under Putin, you know, I mean, it's like double Brezhnev, right? Because they don't talk about the revolution at all anymore, because that cannot be used to legitimize the regime. But the war becomes, the Second World War and the victory in 1945 becomes the great legitimizing point of the Russian state, because you could argue it is also the greatest accomplishment of the Russian state in the 20th century, a state that otherwise didn't accomplish very much for its citizens.
Françoise, as you wrote about the end of communism, the end of Soviet Union. So what was the role of 1939 at that time? So how was the situation with the access to archives? How was this topic present in or not present in the public debate? So what was at that time, and what was in the case of 90s?
I think the historical debate was very important during the Gorbachev time, especially when the archives began to open. It led to a kind of explosion, really an explosion, because all the historical schemes, narratives of the Soviet time were blown up. And people discovered, for instance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop, secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which were denied before. It was only in 1989 that the Soviet confessed to this existence of this secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was very important for the Baltic states, for their national revival, this question of making public the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The discovery of terror was also, I think, very important when Soviet people began to remember, not to remember, they remembered of course, but to be able to share their experience during communist time, because usually parents did not tell their children what they had lived through communism, what experience they had when they were deported or something. They didn't share it with their children. So it was the first time that generation exchanged, and this was also quite explosive. Or it's difficult to imagine now when we see Putin's Russia, but there was such a time. Yes.
Yeah. So the question to all panelists, to Wojciech, to Jan, to Françoise. So what are, according to you, so the main controversies or main blind spots or desiderata for future research on that issue or similar issues or related issues? So, for example, so you are all experts in Eastern European history, experts on Soviet Union, and what are the problems in your conversations with colleagues from other fields of history or other fields of science? So such a cross-field controversies or cross-field considerations, which are not easy or complicated to explain or hard to imagine?
I think up to now the will of the Russian leaders to impose their own interpretation of facts is not successful among Western historians. I would say it's too brutal and too primitive to be really successful. But Russians can also influence the historical research in other ways. They can close the archives, which they do a lot. No, they don't open every archive, and even some archives which were open during the Yeltsin times were closed afterwards during Putin's time. And they can foster a kind of historical research, which is, I would say, essentially sociological. You know, how you lived in an industrial city and so on and so on, which misses completely the political aspects of communism and the whole picture. And this is more dangerous for historians. It's to lose the real perspective of important facts and less important facts. Where historians have to have a sense of proportion of what is important, what is not important. The Russians tend to encourage studies which are completely futile, I would say, if you want to understand what happened in the 20th century. And this is more dangerous, I would say, this irrelevance is more dangerous than the brutal open lies that they use in their propaganda.
Wojciech, from your perspective, so what are the main challenges or main problems in translating East European perspective or East European history into the broader international context?
I think I see that our time is slowly running up. So there is one thing I want to point to. I mean, that I believe it's quite important. That is the misunderstanding, the existing misunderstanding in the West about the threat of communism and the Soviet Union by itself in the 20th century history. I mean, among the scholars, among those people who are familiar with what the Soviet Union was, it's not really happening. But when we talk about broader audience, again, there is this prevailing understanding that the only true evil foe during the 20th century in Europe, it was the Nazi Germany. Now, the Soviet Union is sort of the one that is, well, it was perhaps awkward, it was perhaps not the most comfortable, but still an ally in the great war against the fascism and against the Nazis. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, it's very difficult for, that's what I can say also from the experience I've got at the Pilecki-Institut. It's very difficult to explain how important for the Eastern European countries, and Poland as well, or Poland included, was the confrontation with the Soviet totalitarianism. It's difficult to talk about the deportations to the East, talking about how powerfully it's affected or traumatized also the Polish society. And because it's not the part of common experience in a sense from the entire European continent. And I think, coming to an end, I think this is one of the challenges we're still working on, and I believe this is something that next generations will have to grapple with. Thank you.
To Jan, I have a question from the audience. Jan Behrends, how do you evaluate the Stalin permission for resurrection of the Orthodox Church in 1933? It was only a temporary step back for wartime with Germany, or it was some larger plan and Stalin attempted to find some additional ideological fuel to preserve power after the war? And how it works now in Putin's Russia?
Well, the Orthodox Church in the beginning, of course, was one of the big victims of communism. Already during the Civil War, you know, many priests are killed and churches were burned and so on. But then the actual larger anti-church campaign, of course, was during the so-called Wielki Перелом, during the first five-year plan, when most of the churches and monasteries in Russia are actually shut down. Now, this only changes with the German invasion in 1941, because in 1941, Stalin understands that he needs every resource that he can find in order to win this war. And, you know, Stalin was a man of the church. He had been educated in a church seminary, so he knew a lot about how the church functioned. And he puts it into, or he makes it something like a part of the communist state, the church that is resurrected in the 1940s, then during the war and after the war under Stalin, is of course heavily infiltrated by the secret services. A lot of the priests and bishops are informers to the state, we know that. But it's being tolerated as something that will die out in the end. And then when it doesn't die out, you know, Khrushchev starts the next anti-church campaign in the late 50s, beginning 60s. What we have today is actually more closer to the Stalin model in the way that, again, in Russia, the state controls the Orthodox Church very much. It's loyal to the Putin regime. It is, if you want, a part of that regime. Again, you know, other churches, Protestant, Catholic, you know, Mormons and so on, whatever you have in Russia too, are beginning to be persecuted again in Russia. So you can see that religion or religious institution, especially the Orthodox Church, is seen as something as a pillar of the state. But that doesn't mean that there's something that in the Western understanding we could see as freedom of religion, because freedom of religion would mean that other denominations or other religions would enjoy the same privileges that are granted to the Orthodox Church, and that is, of course, not the case in Putin's Russia.
So we have also one question to Françoise, but I think we have no connection with Françoise now. One more question is, so the question, you mentioned Stalin's communization attempts toward Western Europe. What is your opinion about the agreement between Stalin and Churchill in 1934? What was this agreement, a compromise or a desperate attempt? So Jan, do you want to answer, or?
You mean the whole alliance between Churchill and Stalin? Is that what needs to be evaluated? Or, I mean, Churchill is an interesting figure because he's very much an anti-Bolshevik. In 1918, he's probably the most thorough anti-Bolshevik in British politics during the Russian Revolution, and during the Civil War. He was the one who wanted to send in the British army to end Bolshevism because he saw Bolshevism as a threat to Western civilization. So Stalin and Churchill were very unlikely allies from the beginning, and even during the war. Churchill is very open and frank about it. I mean, he says in his famous speech in the House of Commons, that he has chosen the lesser of two evils. So he doesn't embrace Stalin exactly as his comrade in arms, but he says, I have two evils here, Hitler and Stalin, and I pick the guy who I think is less threatening to the British Empire. So we always have to remember that when we look at it. But I think, on the other hand, Stalin has a certain fascination with strong men. So he can accept someone like Churchill, who is someone with a very staunch position, maybe more than, as Françoise already pointed out, certain people from the left, social democratic leaders and so on, whom we would despise much more than a real, if you want, reactionary like Churchill, where at least he knew, what you see is what you get.
Hello, Françoise.
I'm sorry, I had an internet.
Very, very happy to have you again. So the one question for you. So the last question. So in the light of analysis regarding coherent power structures underpinning the Soviet system, is there any truth to claim that Lenin represented the utopian idealistic face of Bolshevism, whereas Stalin then merely focused cynically on expanding his power bases at any cost? Or were they both simply two sides of the same coin?
I think they were both absolutely on the same, they were both cynics. Lenin was a cynic as well as Stalin. Stalin is a good, I would say, disciple of Lenin. He was really close to the spirit of Leninism. So the difference is that Stalin, I would say, was more personal in his hatreds than Lenin. Lenin was an abstract revolutionary. Stalin had personal hatreds which he tried to satisfy. But both the criminal nature of Bolshevism comes from Lenin. It does not come from Stalin. There is no. It's only natural that Stalin inherited Lenin's system because he was the closest to the spirit of this system.
So thank you. So Jan, you have to go to. Yeah. Okay.
If I may add one brief thought, though, sometimes when you talk about Lenin and Stalin as cynics, which I agree they were cynics, it seems, or it it would seem like they were not true believers in communism. But I think if we look at the archives, we see that they were both, actually. They were true believers in communism, and they were very cynical at the same time, which makes it very interesting. But you know, sometimes, especially before the opening of archives, it was suggested that Stalin was not a cynic. But I think after reading what he said also in closed sessions, we have to admit that, yes, he was a cynic, but he was also very much a communist believer, and he was sort of like driven by both of these forces. At least that would be my take.
So the last question related to this topic you were discussing now, but maybe in a more abstract way. So what was the nature of changing the system in Soviet Union? So how did Soviet Union developed? So, for example, from Lenin to Stalin and later. So, I mean, what was for you? So, the most important factor which contributed how Soviet Union developed, how changed its nature, and what was the most important thing or factor, according to you?
You ask me?
Yes.
Yes. I think the most important factor is the change in the Communist Party, because the change which happens was, the reason is because Stalin always preferred people who were docile executants. You can say that in English, yes. They had no initiative, and they just implemented the policy that Stalin ordered. So the Bolshevik Party, which was very inventive and creative in its way under the early Lenin times, they had talented leaders and diplomats. All this was disappeared with time, because Stalin used to prefer to promote mediocres, dociles, yes men. He prefers yes men. And if you see the evolution of the Soviet system, you see the degradation of the ruling elites. When you see, and even the strength of will, Lenin and Stalin had a huge strength of will to power and everything. Khrushchev already has less strength of will and less. And when you come to Brezhnev and Gorbachev, you see those people who, especially Gorbachev, he was purely a comsomol functionary. He was a yes man. He was not a leader. And so the Bolshevik Party lost the ability to lead, because it was constituted only by yes men, and it excluded true personalities, true leader, real qualities of leadership. This disappeared. And so the system collapsed under its own, I would say, mediocrity. It's one of the reasons. Of course, the economic reason is also that it could not work. Economically, the system did not work. But the main reason, I think, is a crisis among the leadership, in the leadership. And this crisis has led to, and that's why Putin, it explains also Putin's philosophy, because Putin is very aware of that. And this was the reason why he tried to build this image of a strong man and strong leadership. It's a reaction to the late Soviet crisis.
Thank you. Jan?
Just one word about this. Yes, and I think it also goes beyond even the Soviet Union. I mean, we have to imagine the Russian state, which always tries to look like a strong state, actually as a weak state. Because it has weak institutions, it has no legitimization of a takeover of power, of a peaceful takeover of power in the last 120 years. So what we see is we have Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, whatever, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin. It's always personalized rule, and it ends with a putsch or with the death of the leader. And this, so to say, from Tsarism through the Soviet Union through today is, I think, the fundamental weakness of the Russian state, that nobody knows how long these people are going to rule. Same now with Putin. Everybody expected to end either tomorrow or in 20 years, but we don't know, right? And we don't know how it's going to end. Is there going to be a putsch? Is the leader going to die? And we have this problem sort of like go through the whole 100 years, and it was not solved. It was not solved even after the collapse of communism. We still have no mechanism in Russia for peaceful transfer of power from one person to the other. Even under Putin now, we could say that we have no constitution per se anymore, because what he did in the referendum in the summer was basically the end to any sort of even fake constitution. And that's what makes it a very different state to a Western state. I always try to explain this to students, that we cannot think about the choices of Russian leaders as being the same as the choices of the German chancellor, the Polish president, or the French president, because they have a very different institutional setting, or they have an institutional setting. Russia does not have that, even more than 100 years after the revolution. And that is sort of like the larger tragedy behind it, I think.
And the crisis of succession is always a crisis of the state in Russia. And this is what it's the main element of the stability of the Putin regime. People just are afraid of a crisis of the state when Putin goes. And this is really the key of the Russian problem.
So thank you very much. I would like to thank you, Françoise, Wojciech, Jan. I would like to thank our audience. My thanks go also for English-German translation goes to Carolina and Gisela. For technical support, my thanks go to Marek and Patrick and the whole team of Pilecki-Institut Berlin with Hania Radziejowska. And because yesterday it was exactly 1 year after we started in Berlin branch of the Institute, I want to use this opportunity to thank you all panelists of our all debates and events, research programs, our audiences, our colleagues and partner institutions, our colleagues from Warsaw. It was a good year, and first of all I want to thank all colleagues from Berlin team of the Pilecki-Institut and all other people who were engaged. Thank you once again, and see you soon. I think there will be next good opportunities to discuss in future in next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Great pleasure.